morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having invited me to participate in this interesting workshop. And I also have the honor to be the first talk. So we are going to start right now with light, sleep, and circadian rhythms in humans in the field. And we're going to focus on this tool, the ambulatory circadian monitoring. So when we want to study the circadian system, we can focus on the central clock, of course, but we can also focus on inputs and outputs of this system. So if we want to study inputs, we can go for example, the light-dark cycle or how different light sources affects the circadian system. And we have different tools, for example, the photoreceptor contribution models, the pupillometry studies to infer the different light effects, non-visual effects on the circadian system. And of course, we have the ambulatory circadian monitoring systems that allow us to study how the real environment light exposure is in real life. So if we are interested in the output, if we are also interested in another input, like the meal timing, we can also record this through a simple event marker in this system. So if we are interested in the outputs, we can of course perform studies on melatonin secretion and also melatonin suppression. We can also do a PSG to study the different patterns of sleep. And of course, we also have the ambulatory circadian monitoring systems that allows us to record different rhythms in field. If we are interested in the central clock, we need to go for animal models, and we strongly recommend to use a diurnal model if we are interested in the effects in the non-visual effects of light, especially if we are interested in extrapolating those data to humans. So let's go for the ambulatory circadian monitoring, which has multiple advantages. So first of all, it allows to perform sleep and circadian rhythm studies in real-world environments, and it is a multi-day recording. So it allows us to study intra-individual variability through different days or through different periods along the year. And we can also study interday stability, and we can also assess a reliable phase of different rhythms. Because the other advantage is that it is a multivariable recording, so we can study different rhythms happening along different days, and we can also, of course, to calculate the degree of synchronization between those rhythms, and we can study simultaneously inputs and outputs to the circadian system. So it is also very simple to perform multiple simultaneous recordings. So we can perform large-scale studies and study inter-individual variability with a high sample size. So I'm going to focus on this system, which has been developed and validated by our group in the Chrono Lab in the University of Murcia. And this is a very simple device, which has a device status and event marker just here. And we also have a triaxial accelerometer and a wrist temperature sensor, which allows us to record continuously the resting temperature. And we also have 3 light sensors, one for total light exposure, one for circadian light, and one for infrared exposure. So this is useful because it allows us to discriminate between different light sources that the person is exposed to in their daily life. So regarding the circadian light, we incorporated a sensor with a filter for blue light. And here you can see in this plot the sun spectrum, and then the sun spectrum filtered by this filter we are also incorporating in our device. So in red, you have the melatonin suppression curve, and in green, you have the melanopic sensitivity curve. So as you can see, there is a high concordance between these curves. So essentially, the aim of incorporating an infrared sensor is just to try to differentiate between different light sources the person is exposed to. So in this paper, we validated this system, and we were able to differentiate between artificial light sources with low infrared versus full spectrum ratio, and then of course natural light from sun, and then artificial light sources with a high infrared full spectrum ratio. So essentially, these are all the variables we can get from this device. And here we can see visible light, blue light, and infrared light. So what about motor activity? Actigraphy is the main alternative method, for example, for PSG. So here we can get several variables related to motor activity. So we have a triaxial MEMS accelerometer with this high sensitivity, and it allows to detect, for example, posture changes. It also allows us to integrate the composite acceleration values per epoch from those 3 axes. And this variable can indicate as movement, velocity, and intensity. But interestingly, we can also calculate timing movement. And we calculate this as the cumulative time above a very low threshold in periods of 0.1 seconds in which a movement of any of the 3 axes was detected. And finally, we can also discriminate between different types of motor activity precisely because we have the individual X, Y, and Z accelerations. So finally, we can also record risk in temperature. And I'm going to focus on this variable because, well, this is a paper, one of the first papers we published on this variable. And here you can see a working week. This study was performed in students from the University of Murcia. And here, this is a, this is a non-working week. Sorry, this is a mistake. So here you can see how these people presented high values of risk in temperature during the night and low values during the day. And here you can see the typical postprandial increase in risk in temperature. So as you know, the distal peripheral temperature follows an inverse pattern as the core body temperature. So here you can see how we can see this decreasing risk in temperature precisely when they get up. So sorry, because this is a mistake, this should say working week. So here the students had to go to the university, and you can see very clearly how this amplitude is clearly dampened. And this is also interesting because each of these peaks corresponds to different lectures. So this is also, we believe, this is also reflecting diurnal sleepiness. Here you can see how the increase of corresponding to postprandial is quite higher than during the non-working week. So we wondered if we could create a marker, a phase marker from this variable with a high endogenous component. And when we talk about phase markers, we need to talk about DILMO. As you know, DILMO is the time when melatonin starts to increase in dim light conditions. So it reflects the endogenous melatonin rhythm, which is the gold standard for phase marking. So essentially what we did was to evaluate different rhythms from this ambulatory circadian monitoring system. And one of the evenings within that week, we asked the participants to stay at home seated in dim light and to collect different saliva samples. And then we measured melatonin on them, and we plotted this melatonin profile together with the other variables profile. So here we have risk in temperature, here we have motor activity, here we have body position because our system also allows to have the body position. And we have the composite variable TAP, which is a composition from risk in temperature, motor activity, and body position. And we also have the inferred sleep, in this case from sleep diaries. And then we have the light exposure. So when we tried to correlate this, we found that the strongest correlation was found with risk in temperature. And the other interesting thing that was that most of the variables were not predictive to this melatonin increase, but the increase in risk in temperature was predictive to the increase on melatonin secretion. So we actually suggested this phase marker, which is called risk temperature increase onset, and we believe it can be used complementary or maybe as a substitution of the DILMO. So melatonin, risk in temperature is also interesting because we have found that it is also related to the different sleep stages. So here, non-REM 3 sleep stage presents the higher values for risk in temperature. So we also validated this composite variable, which is an evolution from the one I talked about in previous slide. And this is TUPLE, which is a composition of risk in temperature, light exposure, time in movement, which is a variable related to motor activity, of course, and risk position. So we process data by normalizing them, and then we have to invert risk in temperature to get a similar profile to the other ones. And then we integrated them to get the variable TUPLE. So when we got this variable TUPLE, we validated this against polysomnography, and we found that, we set a threshold for this variable, which I think is 0.3. And then when the values of TUPLE go below that threshold, we can infer that the person is asleep. So as you can see here, this is a 7-day recording done by this ambulatory circadian monitoring system. And then when we expand this sleep period, you can see that, that we can see with a high sensitivity, these microarousals here. So time enters through the eyes. This is a sentence from Historias de Cronobios y de Famas by Julio Cortázar. And indeed, the desynchronization between internal, social, and environmental times is the main cause of the sleep circadian disruptions. So actually, we are subjected to 3 times along our life. So we are subjected to sun time or solar time, social time, and biological time. So our circadian health will depend on the relationship between those 3 times, and it will allow us to calculate kind of a probability of developing different circadian sleep disorders. So essentially, environmental time, which is an external time, can be calculated as the center of the solar darkness. And for that, we can use the light exposure recording if we want to do this on actual light exposure, which is not always similar to the sunlight. So for social time, we can go for work schedule, and for sure, meal timing is also a social time. So for that, we can also use this system through this event marker. And finally, we have biological time. Of course, we can do DILMO, but with this system, we can also use the distal temperature acrophase, or M5, which is very related to the center of sleep. So when we get a marker for all these 3 times, we can check the degree of concordance between them, and we can have the degree of chrono disruption or circadian disruption. So here we have an example of a person quite well synchronized. And here you can have the degree of synchronization between them, between the different rhythms. And in this case, this is a person very well synchronized. But here you have an example of a shift worker, nocturnal shift worker. And you can see here how we can calculate this degree of concordance, and we can see how the desynchronization between internal and social time is very high, while the environmental and internal desynchronization is not that high, but social and environmental desynchronization is quite high again. So in this case, we could be performing this test just by using this ambulatory circadian monitoring system. So thank you very much for your time, and I will be happy to respond any questions, suggestions, or whatever. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria, for this great talk, and thanks for kicking off the meeting as well, the workshop. For the participants, if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the Q&A. Even if we don't get to them immediately after the talks, we'll collect them and then use them in the panel discussion. We do have one question, Maria, for you that I'd like to ask you now. This is from Nishal Kamal Karki, who's asking, for the ambulatory sensor, how many days can it record at the highest sensitivity, i.e. at 0.1 second sampling? And generally, how many data points can each unit store?
Yeah, so the two questions are very related. So we can do 14 days, but of course the limit is the battery. So the person would need to recharge the device. So, well, this is very simple to recharge because, well, it's a USB thing. So it's very simple to, with the background, I cannot show that, but yeah, that's yeah, it can. Well, the limit is the battery, not the store capacity. So yeah, 14 days is yeah, it is able to store 14 days.
So that's 14 days at the highest sampling rate.
Yeah.
And so if you presumably, does it scale then with lower sampling rates? So can you do, you know?
Yeah.
So you do 1 second sampling and you do probably not 10 times as long, but much longer than 2 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So I have another question before we move to the next talk, concerning so you know, it's always a question about how do you measure light? What is the what's a reasonable way to measure light in the field? And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the sensor details. So generally, I'm guessing you've calibrated them spectrally in terms of absolute irradiance. Do you have any information about sort of the acceptance angle, right? So these kind of questions that go to more the metrology side. So I was wondering if you had some details on that you could briefly discuss.
Yeah, so that's the eternal question, right? So light is not easy to to measure, especially in the field. And yeah, so we have calibrated this against a spectroradiometer, but of course it would be very interesting to perform different angle and well, we have done that for distances, but I'm not sure if we have done that for different angles. So yeah, that's a very interesting question. And yeah, it has been calibrated versus irradiance.
Okay, great. We have one more question before we move to the next speaker, from Babita Pandey, who's asking, how can one calculate the regularity in sleep-wake timings using actigraphy?
So we have different, well, I'm sure he's aware of the inter-daily stability. So we have different non-parametric indexes, which are quite useful to calculate this. So yeah, non-parametric analysis is what we use.
Excellent, thank you. And then we got one question from Thomas Upton, which I think interests all of us because, of course, we're interested in, you know, I think generally researchers are interested in availability of devices and how can you get them. And so he wants to know, is the ChronoWatch available to buy, or is it exclusively a tool used by your group?
No, actually, we are, yeah, you can buy it. We have a company derived from the group, which is ChronoHealth, and we are sending them. So if you are interested, I can send you the contact person, well, the contact for the person who is in charge of this.
Great, thank you again, Maria, for this really, really exciting talk and for fielding all the questions.